So, was that painless? Painful? Was it helpful to have, did you have enough room on the back for your memory verses? Or did you run out of room?
We have plenty.
Yeah,
More than
There's more than enough room.
Okay, those of you who wrote on there, did you have enough room?
Oh,
There you go.
yes.
Harder than you thought, easier than you thought, about what you thought?
That's not what I thought.
About what you thought?
Yeah, it's good. I don't want to tell you it's easier, it'll get harder.
No, it's not designed to be hard, it's designed to be reinforcement of what we've done. So get your questions out that you've written so far for the New Testament. And just so we're on the right page here, these questions, we're going to share them, but we aren't necessarily going to answer them. Partly because we don't have the time. If we did that, that would do the whole class. And we need to make sure we get some other things done. Part of the whole thing here is to help you understand the depth and the breadth of God's Word, of all of the things that are there that you thought you knew, and now you find out, wait a minute, there are things that I didn't know. There are things that you want to go back later and study. Sometimes you may have a question that's a really simple answer. It's just right in the text. Amanda was telling me she wrote one question down in one verse and then went down about, oh, there's the answer right there.
Yeah.
And that's good. I told her in Bible studies, I've done that lots of times. I know what 3 verses down is, and so I ask the question up here where it brings it up. And if anybody had been paying attention when we read it, they already know the answer, and so they get to get the right answer. And if not, they learn the skill of looking in the context and finding out what the answer is. And there are going to be things that are going to require a block of time or some more resources for you to find out some of those answers, and maybe even collaborate with someone else on some of it. So, you got some questions that you want to share, Tim?
Syllabus said question and answer.
It said questions and answers.
Yeah.
No, just questions.
Did you say just questions?
Questions only.
If it said answers, I'm going to have to change that. It might have had Q&A. That'd be my bad. So, thanks for pointing that out, Tim. Who has some questions you want to share? Amanda has some questions she wants to share.
And this is from the end of Mark. In
Okay.
the last chapter, in verses 17 and 18, it says, these signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up serpents, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover.
Yes.
So how does that reconcile with the fact that we can't drink poison and be okay? I
Good
believe.
question. That's a good question. Because there are whole denominations, well, not whole, several churches that are loosely associated that handle snakes.
And it has the speaking in tongues thing too, which
Yeah.
I've been thinking about, and so that kind of makes it
Yeah.
what it seems like.
We might actually address a little bit of that if we get there in time for class
We
tonight.
should wonder if there was something going on at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a question on the apostles,
Mhm.
how they were selected, because I read something in my reading, but what I read was that most of the apostles were already Christians. They were his followers, and had been converted, and he knew them, but when you read how he selects them, you get the impression that he just walked up and said, you.
Right, right. Yeah. It does seem like that, doesn't it? And so when you take the Gospels as a whole, when you take that harmonizing and coordinating of the Gospel story, you find out that these guys had contact with Jesus before and had been with him for a while, off and on at various times. And so it was never, we get the wrong impression
Okay.
that people, we should just be able to walk up to somebody and say, hey, you want to follow Jesus? Oh, well, why not? What's wrong with you? They had a history, yeah.
Well, it makes more sense that he would pick people that he knew, that were related to him, that would have his back, versus some guy he met on the street.
See, and that's the kind of question that you need to make sure you're able to answer, not only to your satisfaction, but it's a common misconception in our culture, in our Christian culture, especially in the West, that it's just this instantaneous thing. And look at the power of Jesus to draw people to him.
Right.
Well, that's true, but there's the other side of it. It was very practical from that standpoint.
There's the case of the guy that wanted to bury his father, and
Yeah.
he said, we'll get the next one, let the dead bury themselves. There were two.
Yeah.
And I can't remember even the circumstances, but
There were three, actually.
There were three, where, yeah, just, the answer of the candidate was, yes, just a minute, and the response to Jesus was, well, okay.
Never mind. Those are good things to ask the questions about as well. What was, why this? Why the?
Well, he explained, well, lack of faith.
And
In Mark chapter 2, when John's disciples and the Pharisees were, they're talking about why the disciples aren't fasting, why are they fasting? What's going on?
yeah. Why are the Pharisees fasting? Why are John's disciples fasting?
Yeah, and why was it looked down on that Jesus' disciples were not?
Were they fasting for the same reason?
Yeah.
Or was it different things?
Um,
Why would they expect Jesus' disciples to fast?
Yes.
But then there's a half a book on that one. And in general, the general theology is that the Pharisees had built up their own religion.
But we're not wanting to try to answer all the questions now. We want to ask the questions. Okay. Sean and then Mark.
Mine is just a statement, kind of
Okay.
that concept of, man, the apostles just don't get it, do they? Like, how many times you read, like, you just fed 5,000, now you're talking about where we're going to get food at? Like, come on, guys, get with the game. So I just keep noticing that of, especially, obviously, a lot of focus is on Peter, but just like, really? Come on, like, you're seeing stuff, but it just goes, again, in my mind, to prove that the signs and wonders are not what make you a true believer.
Right.
You know, and he states that very clearly, but his closest group are still, you know, Transfiguration, they're still going, are you sure you can do this? What are we going to do? I just find it comical to a certain degree.
It is, and I think we should laugh at ourselves in the midst of that, is what we should do. Mark?
I was just in chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. The
Of Mark?
progressive, Mark,
Okay.
yeah, the progressive healing of the blind man.
Oh,
They
okay.
won't admit, and he says, what do you see? I see shapes and things, and they.
It's like an
Is that supposed to be a picture when you first come to Christ? You know, you're like a baby in Christ, but the picture is unfolded as you're from faith to faith, like he said in Romans. Was he kind of trying to make a picture there of that?
That's an interesting connection.
He does more, and then he
Interesting
says,
application.
now what do you see? Well, now I see clearly.
Is this better or is this worse?
Better, yeah.
In chapter 14, verse 35, and went forward where he fell on the ground and prayed for the possible the hour might pass from him. He actually prayed that 3 times that night. Did he not know? I thought he understood what was ahead of him.
He did. That's why he was praying.
Well, that's the good question. That's the question that deserves some pondering and thinking about the humanity of Jesus and the deity of Christ and where this prayer comes in, because he prayed a lot.
But he told us,
Right, well,
he told them in detail what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And then the night before it happened, praying.
It tells you something. It tells you something about Jesus, and it tells you about the suffering, I think, that he was facing, the reality of it.
Why did the pigs run into the water?
Why did the pigs run into the water?
The demons went in the pigs.
Yeah.
Did they not like, did they have enough sense to just not
Maybe
want to
they
be
had more sense than
the
people did.
demons? And not-
I don't know. That's a good
Does it
question.
say anywhere?
You might want to, no, it doesn't. You might want to talk to a farmer and find out if they know.
Actually, this is not my question, but pigs are one of the smartest animals, period. And maybe they just had a clue.
And maybe they thought he-
More so than the disciples that John was talking about.
My question is in Matthew 26. Do you think the other disciples, the Last Supper, knew Judas was the one that was betraying Christ? Because it's not like a secret. I mean, Christ says, you dip the bread with me. Also, Judas says, surely not I. And he says, well, you said it yourself. They're in a room, unless they're whispering pretty darn quietly. I would think the other disciples would know that.
You would think.
Why wouldn't they take them out?
They They just,
Well,
they really didn't know, because they were asking.
I'm thinking about human
Tim, do you
tendencies.
think the disciples would get a lot more than what they?
In the bigger
And then
picture,
Judas comes up, hello, with a big crowd at the garden and says, oh, wait a minute, here's another clue.
oh, by then it's too late.
Well, yeah. but-
In the midst of the accounts of that evening, there's a very clear snapshot that tells us they did not suspect Judas.
Hmm.
They did not.
Okay.
They were all afraid that it was them.
Yeah. That's right.
They were all afraid that it was them. They
I
didn't.
think there was the thing with John and Peter where Jesus told them,
Or-
well, Jesus
told
told John,
Yes.
and John told Peter.
What's that?
Probably after the fact, to
Yeah.
some degree, yes.
Where is that?
That's the dip, who I dip the bread thing. He was
Saint
talking
John.
specifically to John when he said that.
Yeah, I think that's on John's account. Yes.
Okay, this is
Oh.
in Matthew.
There are more demons expelled in just Matthew, let alone anywhere else, than I've ever heard about being expelled in my whole lifetime. So did they get all the demons in the beginning, or have we forgotten how to do it?
Good question. Good question.
There are still demons in the world, and I've met people who've had them expelled from their life. I met a witch doctor in Kenya who, all of her kids were blind, all of them. And she came to Christ, and her kids after that could see, but she had 6 kids that were all blind. And she couldn't understand why, and she went to the local church and found out, the guy was really honest and said, it's because you're a witch doctor and you practice voodoo. And she changed her life from that moment on, and her life changed dramatically. Kids are also blind. She had more kids, and they are not blind. But, that expulsion of demons and the healing that you see and stuff like that, of people's hands opening up and able to walk that they never walked, and it's pretty amazing.
You're opening a window that is going to expose a whole bigger picture. You have to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of why don't we see that, or do we see it and not see it? So that's one, and then I'll get somebody else.
Jesus twice, once in Matthew and once in Mark, asked the children, or a child, to be brought to him. He puts his hands on their head. Were they baptized?
No.
Was there water?
Was the Holy Spirit is the right?
I don't think I was that.
He didn't say that. He blesses them.
He blesses them, yes. Okay.
You have to do a little more study on the Holy Spirit and the gift of the Holy Spirit and those things. Karen?
I just had a question. It's actually Mark
Getting louder,
3,
Brenda.
where Jesus is preaching in the crowd and his family, his mother and his brothers come. And he makes the point to say, these followers are my mother, my brothers, my sisters. Was he saying that, because they are doing God's will, was he saying that his brothers and his mother, who was married, was not doing God's will?
Interesting question.
You have an answer for
Yeah, that does seem like a kind of issue there, doesn't it?
I would do a word study first.
In parallel passages and just kind of make a mental note as you're reading the rest of the Gospels and check about the brothers, check about Mary. There's some questions of what Mary understood all the way through the times, and where they ended up is also not always clear, but it's there some.
Do we know what happens to Joseph? Is there any of the other historical texts or any supporting that he just disappears? Okay.
Somebody died. But that's a good question. Whatever happened to Joseph? And sometimes it's pure speculation, or you try to paint the clearest picture.
Yeah,
We know he wasn't going to divorce him.
Right. Well, and they must know Joseph because they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" They
Yeah.
named Joseph.
Yeah.
And so
But he had to hang around for a while,
Yeah.
because Jesus was first, and there were
Yeah.
three sisters, 4 brothers, something like that?
yeah.
Well, and Joseph was still around when Jesus was a child in that one thing with the 10
When he was
soldiers.
12.
So he's
Well,
12.
and it was,
Yeah.
so they must know him even because he's 30.
He has 7 siblings.
And could just die.
Presumably, he died before Jesus was, in his 30s.
Sounds like, yeah.
That's the speculation.
I think it was hard.
Some things we just can't know for sure. But you have these holes in the story, and then when you fill in all of this around, you get a decent shape of what piece goes in that place. It may not be, you may not know exactly what it is, but you know that it's a shape of something like this. So here's a hole that's left by Joseph. And once you kind of figure everything around, you kind of, well, what's the best scenario? And ultimately, it's just a matter of curiosity as opposed to importance.
Well, I think you ought to pick one question or we can answer.
One question a week.
At the end of class, there's like,
He marked the tree that he cursed in
The cursed fig tree?
If that wasn't a picture of Israel, and he went to, there was no fruit there, so he cursed the tree, and said, never again will this produce fruit. Oh, he's,
It seems a little spiteful, but
that was a
Yeah, I
statement
think he
about
was just
Israel.
ticked off the tree.
Remind me.
Are you
not to
saying
get-
very guy?
I mean, he's Jesus. He can do anything.
Let me give you a hint. 2 chapters later in Mark, after the chapter after he does that, the next day, he gives a parable about the fig tree.
And then he gets a report back, hey boss, it all withered up and fell over.
Yeah, overnight. Yeah. Okay, let's get to our stuff here tonight, and hopefully we'll have things that work okay. Here. So the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of the servant, the son who came to serve. Can you imagine, just take a wild guess at what the theme of Mark might be? Servant. A servant. Matthew, he was the king. Mark, he's the servant of God. A lot of the prophets talk about my servant. And a lot, you'll see it capitalized, my servant, because it's referring to the Messiah coming and all that's going to come from that. Mark is absolutely one of my favorite Gospels. I have 4 favorite Gospels, and Mark is one of them. I preached through Mark twice. And just to give you a heads up, I did preach through the latter part of chapter 16 both times, for what it's worth. I guess I could do this. There we go. Matthew was an eyewitness to the life and ministry of Jesus. Mark was not. He had some connection there. He was alive. He had more of a connection with Peter and Paul and with Barnabas, obviously, part of the early church. So he had seen some of it, although he hadn't been one of those disciples that traveled with Jesus. But his family was connected there. Matthew writes to the Jews. Mark writes to the Gentiles. Some want to classify it even more so to the Romans, or to those with the Roman mentality. Jesus is presented as king in Matthew, and in Mark he is presented as a servant. In Matthew, the focus is on those discourses, those 6 discourses that are built around there. The sermons.
Back and forth. I wrote 6, crossed out 7. There is one that's actually, could be the 7.
Oh, come on. It's the one that could be the 6th was the issue, I think.
You've been marked down for lack of faith.
The focus in Mark is on the miracles, the work of this servant. We're going to see there's only 2 sermons that are recorded in Mark and a little truncated to some degree, a little edited. There's some bits and pieces, and there's times that the times that he speaks with the disciples are solid and there, but the times that he speaks to the crowds and gives long messages are not there, but they're not there for a reason. We find Mark in the scriptures. Mark has another name. His name is John. John is his Hebrew name, and Mark, or Marcus, would be his Latin name, or his Greek name. We first meet him in Acts, first time we meet him by name is in Acts chapter 12, when Peter gets out of prison. And he gets miraculously released from prison, makes his way to a house, and that house belongs to Mark's mother, Mary. And he's mentioned there as if whoever's reading this would understand, oh, okay, John Mark, okay, it's John Mark's mom. It's Mary's house. Okay, I know where that is. It was interesting, too, that Rhoda, who was the servant girl who answered the door, answered the gate, recognized his voice. So it sounds like Peter had been around there often. One of the things that's interesting about us as humans, we recognize voices pretty quickly, usually. If you answer the phone and they say hello, most of the time you can tell. Now, if you call my house, depending on the time of age of my sons, you would say, Linda? And they would say, no, this is Jeremy. Or you might say, Pastor Russ? No, this is Jeremy. But we recognize that voice. And Peter had been around enough, apparently, to be recognized there, and that was John Mark's house. Verse 25, sometimes we miss this reference to him because after Paul and Barnabas had done their duty in delivering some stuff to Jerusalem, they went back to Antioch and they took John Mark with them. It says there in verse 25. Acts 13:5 is where we again meet John Mark, that he is headed out on this first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas. And they make it to the island of Cyprus, and when they head across to the mainland again, it says that John Mark goes home. He decides, for whatever reason, he can't do this. Then later on, in verses 37 to 39 of chapter 15, when second time, let's go back and visit these churches. Barney says, hey, let's take John Mark. And Paul says, no way. He bailed on us last time. No, I think we should. No, I think we shouldn't. And it got to be such a disagreement that they split ways. And Barnabas took John Mark, and where did he head? Cyprus, which actually was Barnabas's home area. Probably where Mark's family was from to some degree as well. But it was also the first stop on their first journey. So it was like Barnabas and Mark took the southern route, and Paul and Silas headed up around the curve and visited the other church. He's mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, and in Philemon, verse 24, as somebody who was with Paul. 2 Timothy 4:11 is one of those redemptive verses where it says, bring John Mark, bring Mark with you, because he is useful to me. This was at the end of Paul's life. He wanted Mark to be there. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter calls him my son. And there's this connection that we see here, and we see it there in Acts 12. So at the early part of the development of the church, Peter and Mark have a connection, Peter and John Mark. And towards the end of Peter's life, maybe not quite to the end of 1 Peter chapter 5, but they have a connection there as well. And then we have this passage in Mark 14, verses 51 and 52. We have an unnamed man, young man, in the garden, wearing nothing but a sheet. And somebody grabs a hold of that sheet, and he gets wiggled free from that sheet and heads out. He was trying to figure out what was going on. A lot of people think that was probably John Mark that was there. He was a young man. He would have some sort of connection. There's speculation that maybe the meal had been at John Mark's house. There's no way to prove that. But that's part of the speculation, that maybe John Mark followed them there after they left. Who knows?
But was John Mark from a wealthy family?
It appears to be so. had a big enough house to host the church for the prayer meeting, and it was seemed to be a regular gathering place. Some even think that Mary, his mother, might have just donated the house and property to the church, or made it available for them to use all the time. It was apparently a fairly common thing for wealthy widows from Cyprus to come to Jerusalem to die. At least get back to Jerusalem before you die. So that may be why they were there. His father was obviously gone if she was a widow.
Couldn't afford clothes, I don't know.
Couldn't afford clothes, yeah, not very. These are some of the things that John Mark would have been involved with, or Marcus John. He was in Jerusalem with the apostles. He was in Jerusalem at the crucifixion, you can guarantee that. Don't have a clue as to how old he was at any of these given times. He was at Antioch and was involved in reaching out to the Gentiles, not only in Antioch, but on that missionary journey. He had 2 Eastern Mediterranean mission trips. One was cut short, and the other only went to the same place he went before. Don't know where they went beyond that, but then we know they went there. It's not a biblical declaration of things, but it's certainly a historical connection that Mark was in Rome when Paul was in Rome and when Peter was in Rome. We can see that. So he had connections with Paul and with Peter and with Barnabas. Pretty close connections. Paul said he's one of my co-workers. He's a co-laborer. He's good and useful to me bringing. And Peter, he was said to be Peter's secretary, his interpreter, more likely his transcriber, took notes on what Peter had to say, and Peter died in Rome. The date of this book's writing is, as most of them are, a little speculative. Some of them will have it being written as early as the mid-50s, but that's because they want to say Mark was first, and then Matthew used Mark's chronology to build his, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark both and other things. They're guessing. In fact, they make up a whole nother document that they don't know, it doesn't exist anymore, but it's cute, and it's another document that they all drew from.
What do you mean by that? Q. And
That's the name
now
of-
said that it doesn't exist anymore?
Right, yeah.
Or it doesn't exist at all?
Well,
It may have.
they think it may have. They have no proof that it has, other than because they don't believe that they take a pretty low view of Mark especially. That where would he get this information? And it comes out so different. It's not very refined. And then if Matthew and Luke are going to come up with very similar things, or Matthew and Mark especially, the chronology and the stuff there, and how would they do that? Well, they must have copied each other, or they had another document that they used. And then where would Luke? Luke used other documents. He said, I researched
As much as it says so.
yeah, I went around and got as much information as I could, from wherever I could. And so they're guessing and making it up, and it's maddening, because then they want to build a whole case on all kinds of things. More than likely, that the tradition says that it was written shortly after Peter's death. Could have been shortly before, and Peter died about 67 AD. Also in 64 to 67 is kind of the persecution kicked up in 64, and so it was sometime after that. So more than likely, it was as early as 64, as late as 68, certainly before the fall of Jerusalem.
Did Peter die in Jerusalem?
No, Peter died in Rome.
How do we know that?
His history.
Fox.
Fox, yeah. I think
He was crucified.
Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Mr. Channel.
No, I think that some of the church fathers, which would be the disciples of the apostles, and some of the history that we have some history as early as mid 100s. So maybe even maybe a few years after that. That's kind of the tradition that was there. And we can't just dismiss something because of tradition. You can't just say, well, it doesn't count because it's tradition. It could be. It's much less speculative than an imaginary document called Q, if you ask me. What was the occasion for this writing? Why would he write something like this? Peter's preaching was about to be lost. And in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 15, he says, I'm going to remind you, and I'm going to try to make sure that you remember when I'm gone. And the theory kind of goes this way, that as Peter would preach, he would tell the stories of what Jesus did. And at some point, Mark or somebody got the bright idea, we should write these things down, because as long as we've got the apostles around, we don't need to write anything down. We've got it already. But when they start getting older, when persecution begins to arise and you start losing them, James is gone. Oh, we could lose others. We need to get something down because we may not remember it well. And how long can we remember it and pass it on? And so the idea is that John Mark would write down, I forget which guy it was, one of the historian guys early on, made the comment that Peter knew what John was doing, and John was trying to be faithful and only going to write down what he said and nothing more. And Peter knew and didn't prohibit it, didn't necessarily encourage it. Okay, it's what it is. They were going to lose it. And up in Woodland, when we were living there, one of the teachers at the school had this project. And he had an English class that he taught, and he would have his students go and interview, he would line up all the old timers in the valley up there and get his students to go interview them with the tape recorder and ask them a series of questions and get them to talk about the old days and what it was like back in the day. And then they would have to write up a report and put this all together, and they would make it available to the community, make it available to the people who were involved in it, trying to maintain the stories. What was life like up the Lewis River Valley back in the day? What was life like up at Rob's place before Rob got there? That was still a long time ago, but not as long as that. So that was part of the idea. There was the need for a clear, event-driven account of this thing, especially when you're dealing with Gentiles, people who didn't live in Jerusalem. Now you're outside of the city. Now you're outside of the land of Israel. People don't know what happened. So we need to get these things down, an event-driven account, as opposed to Matthew's, which nothing wrong with Matthew's for sure. Matthew's is more on the teaching side. Mark's is more on the event side. It shows Jesus as the saving event. It was designed, just as Matthew ultimately was, just as John was, just as Luke was, as an evangelistic tool to try to help people understand who this Jesus is that we're asking you to believe in. Yes.
We talked line in the 2 Peter.
Yes.
What's the big long word on the end?
Catechism.
Rob knows what that means.
It was the opportunity for people to learn, to be catechized, to be taught about the life of Christ so that you could answer questions, so you could have a quiz and get it right.
I'm glad we have an old tradition.
So it was targeted to non-Jewish readers. There's some thought that Romans were even more so, or at least the Roman culture, as opposed to the Greek culture. And we'll see some of those things here. There was there was no genealogy, no birth story. Partly because, what's the point? Who are we trying to present to people? The servant. Who cares where the servant was born? Who cares where the servant's parents were from? They are nobody, at least in many ways. And it didn't matter to them if he was descendant of Abraham or connected to David. There are some Latinisms in there. In 1242, Mark writes about a woman who comes with 2 small copper coins. And then he explains what that is. And he explains it using a Latin concept. What does he call it? He calls it two small copper coins, which is a cent, penny. We use that because we have Latin-based ideas. And so, and there's several of those type of things as you run through there. This is an interesting one, Rufus. Rufus is mentioned by Paul in Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Rufus is also mentioned in Mark. In, got to turn the page and I can tell you what it's in the, his dad is mentioned and Rufus is mentioned as well, as he mentions his dad. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. Who was Rufus's dad? Who was Rufus's brother?
Simon of Cyrene, and was it Alexander?
Alexander is Rufus's brother. Simon of Cyrene was Rufus's dad. And Simon of Cyrene was the guy who carried the cross for Jesus. And so when Mark is writing about that event and he mentions Simon of, he says, oh, that's Alexander and Rufus's dad. As if it matters. As if it's important. As if somebody might know what he's talking about. And Rufus was known in Rome when Paul wrote his letter. This is kind of an interesting one here in chapter 15, verses 44 and 45. He's giving the account of Jesus dying and the fact that Jesus is already dead on the cross. And so every Roman would know that when you are hung on the cross, you don't die quickly. You die long ways down the road, days usually. So it was unusual, unless they're going to break your legs so that you suffocate. So they came to break his legs. He was already dead. Well, how in the world could he already be dead? Maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he just swooned. And so he describes this kind of an autopsy and doesn't know he was really dead. He has to explain it. There's a little parenthetical statement there explaining some of that because the Romans would say, that doesn't make any sense, that he would be dead already. Which was part of the point that they needed to learn, that he yielded his life. Explanations of customs here in chapter 7, verse 24. He said, he talking about the washing of hands, and he said, oh, I got to let you know, these guys wash their hands all the time before they do anything. Because the Roman, well, what's all this water and what's all this washing thing that they do? And so he gives a little explanation because he's writing to people that's not their culture. And so he's relating it back. There is very little Jewish coloring in Mark. There's some time in Jerusalem and some time in Judea, but you don't get the flavor that you get in Matthew, where everything is so Jewish. It's not nearly what it would be there. This is a little bit of an outline of Mark that doesn't necessarily fit exactly the outline we have in our book, which we'll go over in a minute. But it does. You can only divide it up so many ways. It's pretty much the same division in anything that you would get, more or less. The prologue is short and to the point. Jesus, the Son of God. The Gospel according to Jesus, the Son of God. There's the time of his public ministry. That prologue covers through just the first 13 verses of chapter 1. His baptism, his temptation, and then his public ministry. Primarily this first part in Galilee and in the Gentile regions. There's a whole year where Jesus was in Jerusalem and Judea that aren't covered here. Which is where some of those guys spent time with Jesus at other times. So he's looking at the time in Galilee, and he does a lot among the Gentiles. We'll look at that later. We'll try to make note of that. We'll look at a map and see. Chapter 8, verse 27 is this central point. Who do men say that I am? This rising action, this building up of his ministry and his work, who is Jesus? Who is he? Who do men say that I am? And then there's this decline. What did he come to accomplish? This falling action coming down, as it were, to the cross, to death. After chapter 8, verse 27, as we get into this next section, there's that mark again. where we had it in Matthew, chapter 12, chapter 13, where the issue of he was demonized, and it's by the power of Beelzebub, and the unpardonable sin, and now he begins to speak in parables. Very similar instance happens right here. He begins to talk more privately to the disciples as opposed to the crowds, although the two main sermons that are recorded are in this section after that. It's on the road to Jerusalem. There's this public ministry in Jerusalem and his death and resurrection. The service of the servant, the suffering of the servant. I think we'll take a break here and let you have some peanut butter, chocolate, cheesecake, and some snickerdoodles, and whatever else is out. I have no idea. Rob graded it, so.
Oh, that's Rob, Pastor Rob the Merciful.
Not my test. I haven't seen any mercy on mine.
Hopefully, you have this as your resource now. It should be easy enough to figure out whatever the wrong answer was and what the right one was, and if you need some help, we can clarify that. These questions here will be on the final test. No tricks, no rewording necessarily. Well, I don't know how I'm going to reword. I don't know if I'll reword the repetition with variety is essential to learning, but those things will be on the test again, and hopefully it'll be a good learning experience. We've all had that experience where we've taken something, we thought, oh great, I blew it, I don't even know these things, and then if I gave you that test again tomorrow or next week, even if you didn't study for it, oh yeah, I remember that one. Oh yeah, I remember that one. So that stress level that comes from trying to remember some things gets enhanced for us. So, okay, so we are continuing to look at the characteristics, some of the stuff about the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, Jesus is seen as rigorous, as persistent, as that's supposed to be strenuous. That is strenuous. Strenuous, relentless. He goes. When we look at some of the words here in a minute, it's pretty astounding when you count words. There are 18 miracles in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's the shortest gospel, and it's got more action than you can shake a stick at, as they say. And I'm assuming that means a lot, because you can shake a stick at a lot of things. Only 2 are found in Mark. Those 18, there's 2 of them that aren't found anywhere else. In chapter 7 and chapter 8, the deaf man. And notice this, it's in Decapolis. And the blind man in Bethsaida. In your Nelson's Maps book, take a look at that. Page 310. It's in the Matthew section where it is. There might be another map somewhere in here, but this one looked like it was good enough for what we needed. He has a listing of miracles, not all of them obviously that Jesus did, because there were 36 or 39 recorded in the Gospels. But notice the ones about Mark. They're at the top of the page in the district of Tyre and Sidon. Mark chapter 7. Do you see that one? Outside the boundaries. If you look at the blind man there in Bethsaida, where is Bethsaida? It's not in Galilee. It's not in Judea. It's in
The Golan Heights.
the Golan Heights. Yeah, the Golan Heights. Outside the realm, more into Gentile-type territory. Decapolis, do you see Decapolis there? It's on the bottom right side, you see Decapolis? Not only did you have the blind man, or the deaf man in the Decapolis region, you had the demonic guy in Gadara. Jesus walks on the water, we don't know which side of the lake it was on, but they put it kind of on that side. That's pretty indicative of what you see with Mark, because there's a lot of Gentiles. There's a lot of non-Jewish people that Jesus touched their lives, or they're Jews that are living in Gentile territory. So that's gives that flavor of trying to reach those who are not Jewish. Teaching is mentioned. It's mentioned not just these places, but several places in Mark. He mentions it just as Jesus taught a bunch of people. Jesus went here and he taught the crowds, and everybody was amazed. Doesn't go into the great detail about what he taught, just the fact that he did. Because what's John all about? The servant. And servants are supposed to do something. And Jesus did. 2 sermons are recorded. Chapter 4, chapter 13. I had that chapter 4 in the wrong place earlier. The parables of the kingdom. Because in this chronology, which is not a chronology, it's just a collection. And there's no way that it goes in chronological order.
Mark doesn't?
Mark doesn't really go in. It's just kind of this area, and there's a collection of things that happen there. This is the breaking point in Matthew, the parables of the kingdom. Here it is in chapter 4. And then chapter 13 is the Olivet Discourse. Not exactly the same, but fairly close, because this is more towards the disciples in the time that he spends with them as he began to pull away from the crowds. The servant is evident in his work. I guess you could use that as kind of what you would see in Mark. How do you know that this servant is a good servant? By what they accomplish. What have you done for me lately? Is the way we callously look at it. We see the dignity of Jesus in this. Jesus comes off pretty strong. Comes off as a hero. Obviously more than a servant. If he's the servant, he must be serving somebody really, really great. Because he's a pretty great guy. And look at all that he has done. And I thought of your comment about the disciples. There's no halo on the disciples in Mark. Most of those things that we'll chuckle about with the disciples, you'll find in Mark. We chuckle at their ignorance. Let's look at those 2 passages, just so we get a chance to see ourselves in the mirror. Mark chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. This was the one that you mentioned, Sean. They just had a miraculous feeding. 4,000 people fed. There's 4,000, and then there's the 5,000 later. And some interesting things that Mark brings out that none of the other writers do. But look at their discussion as they follow up on this. Because when they got done, Jesus warned them. He said, here's this opportunity to teach them something from this miraculous thing. Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. And so these guys are sharp. They're starting to figure out there's a spiritual thing here. There's this weird interpretation of some things that are said. It doesn't really mean what they say. They mean something else, right? So they begin to discuss with themselves the fact that they have no bread. They have no bread. Maybe. Is he getting on to us because we didn't have bread? We didn't have enough for everybody there? Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? What did I just do? And you're worried about having bread. That doesn't work. And this is not like right out of the chute. This is not early on in the process. They've been with Jesus for a while. They've seen what he's done. Chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. This is right after the Transfiguration. This is one of my favorite things about the disciples, because it hits us on how dense we are, all of us. As they were coming down from the mountain, and this is the inner circle. These are the guys that are close to Jesus. We're not talking about the guys on the edge. We're talking about the guys up close and personal. They saw Jesus transfigured, and it was astounding.
Well, that wasn't all they saw.
No, they saw it.
Elijah and Moses.
Yeah. So as they were coming down from the mountain, he gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. Let me stop there for a second because that brings up a point. There's a little phrase they use about the messianic secret that Jesus in Mark over and over says, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody. I healed you, go do that, but don't say anything. And in Mark was where we see that when he tells the guy not to go tell anybody, he goes talk, and he couldn't go in the towns anymore. He had to go out, and that's why they ended up in the wilderness with 4,000, 5,000 people needing to be fed. But why would Jesus not tell? Why didn't he want them to tell? Partly because of the inability to move about, partly because of the tendency to turn him into a Messiah who's only here to feed me and only here to heal me instead of the process of what he needs to do. He had a job to do, and this would get in the way if they carried it too far, which sometimes disciples are known to do. Believers are known to do. So, they're coming down. Jesus says, don't tell anybody until the Son of Man rose from the dead. They seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. What do you think rising from the dead means? It can't mean that he's going to die. He'll rise from the ashes of imprisonment, or it'll look like it's falling apart, but he'll come through at the last minute. It can't mean that he's going to die. Even though he had told them that from the very beginning. There was never any question about what Jesus was going to do. He told them, and he told them, and he told them plainly. There was no parable. There was no mystery. Here it is. And they come off not looking very sharp here. How do you think, if Mark was the transcriber, the taker of notes, and he heard Peter, why would Peter doesn't come off real sharp here sometimes? Just like Matthew is the one that outs himself as the Levite who was the tax gatherer, the tax collector. Peter, I think, was pretty open about, that's me, I'm the one. I didn't get it. None of us got it. And Peter was the one that so often gets kind of put on the front lines for that. One of the other things that's supposed to be working here. This one.
It's been transfigured.
Now it's
Let's go.
It is, look at that. That's nice.
Try it again. There we go. It froze up for some reason. There's a vividness about Mark's. When you look at the cross references, where it's in Matthew and it's in Mark, or whether it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he adds details and touches and things to it that we don't always see. His language is a little rougher, not as polished. There's more conjunction. I'll show it in a minute. He uses the word "and." Let's see if I've got it ahead of time. You've got it there. 1,300 times.
Is that what it was?
Yes, 1,300 times. In 600 and something verses. And it's like the little kid who doesn't want to stop saying something so that you can get in it. And
Yeah.
it just goes on and on and on. It doesn't stop. Look at Jesus' reactions. We see things that how Jesus reacts emotionally towards things that we don't get in the other Gospels. Look at 3:5, and then someone else turn to 10 and have 14 and 21. And read those for us, if you would.
I got 3:5.
Okay, nice and loud.
It says, after looking at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored.
So here's the man with the withered hand. And in Matthew, it doesn't give you the details of his reaction. He just said, he looks at, he says there, reach out your hand. In Mark, he looks at them, he's angry. He's grieved over their hardness of heart, that you would not want me to heal this guy because it's the Sabbath. What's wrong with you? That's not a picture of Jesus that you see in the other Gospels. Chapter 10, verse 14. Jim?
But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Permit the children to come to me, do not hinder them. For the kingdom of God belongs to such as these."
So what was the problem? The disciples were saying,
Go away, don't bother us.
yeah, go away, don't bother us. We don't need you here. Jesus is dealing with important people, adults. And in Matthew, Jesus just says what he says. But Mark tells us that there was some emotion in that. He was upset at his disciples. I don't know if he gave them the look. I don't know if he rolled his eyes. I often think a lot of times Jesus rolled his eyes. That's just my opinion. I know that he sighed. Is that verse 21? Is 10:21 the sigh? No? There's another one where he sighs. Because they come and always when they ask him for a sign, after all, and it says he sighed. How long do I have to put up with you? That makes it sound different when you know that. What was 21? What was 10:21?
Looking at him, Jesus felt a love for him and said to him, "One thing you lack, go and sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me."
Yeah, the rich young ruler guy. He's there, and in Matthew's account, it's just matter of fact. Mark says, Jesus looked on him and loved him, had great compassion and love for him. Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? It doesn't sound nearly as hard whenever he looks at him and loves him. And Mark has all kinds of things like that. So if you're reading along and you see the little thing at the tail end of your verse that says Matthew 8:11 through 13, then you go over and look at that and then compare those, and you'll see some details, especially with the reactions from Jesus that we don't normally get.
There's 4 ands in that verse.
4 hands on that verse. There's no chronological movement. It's not in a clear... Doesn't often tell you. He tells you once in a while where he is, but it's not that big a deal because nobody in Rome knows where these places are anyway. There is a geographical ordering. There's an area. The first 4 chapters are pretty much there in Galilee. The next chapters are outside of Galilee in the Decapolis and some of those other regions. 10 and 11 are in Judea as they're heading to Jerusalem for that last week and for his crucifixion. Okay, some characteristics. 1:1. I was reading some stuff early, and they were these guys that were bashing Mark as if he really was Mark. It was probably somebody else who had written it. And the guy didn't know what he was talking about, and he didn't do a good job, and he doesn't represent Jesus as the Son of God. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I think he does. He starts out in 1:1. Does he identify Jesus as the Son of God? Very much so. And you see actions that Jesus takes, things that Jesus does that identify him as the Son of God, and there's a confession somewhere in here, in all of these places here. This one is at his baptism. Who confesses that he's the Son of God?
God.
This is my beloved Son. And then some of these are demons that confess that he's the Son of God. And then in 1539, who's that guy? Who's 1539? Nope, not Peter. Peter's
Pilate.
one of those.
Pilate?
Nope, at the cross. The Roman centurion. So if you compare 1:1 at the beginning of the book with 1539, which is almost at the end, you book in the idea, who is this servant of God? He is the Son of God. Who is the servant of God? Surely, I'll tell you what, this was the Son of God. And if you get John Wayne to do it,
We might
So-
sell it.
This is a son of God. I can't do a good job. 11 times it says in Mark that people were amazed. One of those was the disciples were amazed. They were blown out of the water. It's over and over again. Their response to his teaching as well as to his miracles. It wasn't just his miracles that amazed them, it was his teaching that amazed them, even though Mark doesn't give you a lot of detail on that. But it's the same reference that Matthew uses when he says, they were amazed. This guy teaches not like the scribes and Pharisees. This guy's got authority. This is astounding. 14 times he describes himself as the Messiah. Most often as the Son of Man, which is a messianic term from Daniel. And in the context, you can see how that works. 40 times he says, immediately. He finishes one thing, and then as soon as that little vignette, that little sound bite is done of what Jesus did, immediately he did this. And immediately he did that. Oh, it's a race. 1,300 times the word "and" is there. To string it all together. He did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. And then he went over there, and he went over there, and these people came, and those people went. There's a regular use of the historic present. Here are 2 examples of what that means. I had to look it up, because I didn't know what the historic present was.
But that's the present that Pastor Ron used last night. We started then and continued.
2:5.
You think?
What's the historic present used there?
Your sins are forgiven.
Nope. Historic present means something that is stated, not just that it happened, but it's in the midst of happening right now. Even though it was something that happened back in, it's like it's happening right now. And that's a little subtle way to make it seem active. It was, he's seeing his faith.
Not with faith.
He didn't just, he always saw his faith.
Well, yeah, in the King James, it just says saw.
Yeah. But the sense of it is that it's seen. There's an active part of it. Look at verse 17, 2:17. They were complaining that he was eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. And hearing this, and there's a lot of this ing stuff going on in Mark, and it's a very subtle little thing that moves you along. It keeps movement. Oh, he saw this, and we stop because, okay, he saw something. What did he see? No. And seeing this, he responds. Not that he saw it and then figured out what to do. Seeing it, he responded. It's very subtle, but it carries through that action. What if my battery is dead? So this is the outline that we have in our book in Benoit. I always forget his name. Benoit's book. The presentation of the Lord's servant. This is the opening. Not a big fanfare, not a big detail. And when you read Matthew and when you read Luke, there's a lot there, especially Luke. And here it's just bare bones. He's got his forerunner mentioned there. Again, John the Baptist, much more important than most of us can begin to imagine and realize. Has about his baptism, has about his temptation. Not a whole lot of need for everybody to know a whole bunch of other things about that, apparently, in Rome, other than the fact that it happened. Manifestation of the Lord's servant. His preaching in Galilee. So he's got, 18 verses, 19 verses in his preaching in Galilee. His healing in Galilee. Quite a bit more. And then he's got his conflict with the scribes. This is an interesting little study. fact, turn there. Turn to 2, chapter 2. It starts at verse 1 and it goes through chapter 3, verse 6. Just starts kind of skimming through there and see who is it that he has a conflict with and what does he have the conflict about. So what's the first one?
The Pharisees.
Scribes.
Pharisees, the scribes.
The
The
scribes.
teachers of the law. So
Right, teachers of the law.
They were questioning his ability to forgive sin.
Yeah, why does he say forgive sins? He's blaspheming. So that was the one conflict. What's the next one that comes up? He ate with sinners. Pharisees didn't like that at all. So there you got the scribes, who aren't Pharisees as well, and you got the Pharisees, who aren't necessarily scribes. And then what's the next one? The thing you brought up. The Pharisees and John's disciples were fasting. Some ritual thing, some religious thing. Hey, how come your disciples aren't fasting? Okay? The next one comes up.
Taking on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Sabbath issue. And who is it with? Pharisees again. One more. Chapter 3.
Healing on the Sabbath.
Again, healing on the Sabbath. Conflict. All grouped together. I don't know that they happened historically back to back. Wouldn't surprise me if it did, but there's got to be some time for them to walk from one place to the other, in the midst of this. But for Mark's purposes, he's saying, he went up in Galilee and he preached. He did a lot of healing and showed his power, and then he had these conflicts with the scribes. Opposition to the Lord's servants. Well, we had it at the end of the other chapter, that other section, didn't we? These things aren't hard and fast. He became more and more popular, but there was increased opposition, just like we see in the book of Acts where we're reading in our quiet time. Paul and Barnabas go in, they become successful, they win people to Christ, and what happens? There's jealousy, and the Jewish leaders get upset, and then there's opposition, and then they chase them all over the land, opposing them. There was teaching. This teaching, because of the opposition, was primarily to his disciples. When there would be this opposition, Jesus would turn to his disciples and begin to instruct them. These people weren't listening. These guys were. And so he was going to make sure they were taught what they needed to learn from all of this. And then the works of the servant. In fact, I think the thing in the books is increasing more works or increasing abundant works, something like that. The idea that there's a lot of works because he does a lot of things. Instructions to the disciples. This is on the road as they go from Galilee to Jerusalem. They finish up in Galilee after this encounter here with the accusation of being demonized. And so he turns to his disciples, and then all the way down to Jerusalem he teaches them. Not only about what's going to happen when they get there, but also about the things that are to come. And as all of the Gospels do, all of the Gospels focus on the passion, on the crucifixion of Christ and his resurrection. That's what it's all about. All of this other stuff sets the stage for us to see the important event. And the important event here is Jesus offering himself as the servant of God, the sacrifice for our sins. So we've got the triumphal entry that comes here. And in the midst of this, there are little tidbits here and there that you see from Mark that you don't see other places. There's disputes with leaders, of course. You get the prophetic teaching. This is the Olivet Discourse right here. You get the preparatory events of getting ready for the meal. I don't know that there's a lot of parallel, but there was some thought about the parallel between getting the donkey and getting the house for the Last Supper thing. I looked at it a little bit. I didn't see it. I may be just one of those disciples that's kind of not getting it. So you might find it and have something great out of that. There's the meal, the evening meal together, and the things that take place there, and then they head off to Gethsemane, where Jesus is betrayed and some young man gets his clothes taken. Or his sheet that's covering it taken. There are the trials. He's not, it's a shortened version of the trials. He doesn't go to Herod here. He's before his accusers. He goes to Pilate. I don't remember if it's only once or maybe it's twice there. There's the crucifixion scene. He gives some details, some ideas that maybe aren't in the other places, help piece some things together. And then there's the burial of Christ. There's the explanation about the fact that, yeah, he really was dead. It wasn't a swoon or something. And then finally, the resurrection of the Lord's servant, the last chapter. Pretty short, abrupt ending, wouldn't you say? If you stop at verse 8, you go back here, let's go back to chapter 16. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. You think it's possible that John, Mark, meant to stop there? That was the end of the story. It's possible. It seems rather abrupt, doesn't it? It's like you're going 100 miles an hour, and all of a sudden you stop.
It started pretty abruptly too.
He did start very abruptly. Starts quick, ends quick. It fits from the standpoint of the nature of the book. If you found yourself reading the Gospel of Mark in a group, which would be the idea, you'd be hearing this. Maybe you knew some of these stories. You'd heard Peter tell us some of them. And now Mark's compiled all these things together. And he's going on. And you get to there, and that's the last word. What would be your response?
Something missing.
Where's the next page?
Where's the next page? Something's missing. I want to know more. I want to know more about what's going on.
It's inconclusive, he needs to come back.
Well, this is part of that crudeness that they see there. Literarily, he's not very polished. He just kind of ends it there. And so if there was this abrupt ending, there could have been a method to the madness of saying, oh, there's more, yeah. It's not written here, but we've got more that we can tell you. We just don't have it written down yet. That's a real possibility.
But the little book didn't think so.
The little book didn't think so? The little book didn't think so. There's the secondary ending. That if you would go from 16:1 through 8, and then if you go, some of your Bibles will have it at the very end, there's a tag in there that tries to kind of summarize and wrap it up. In the New American Standard it says, and they promptly reported. After they didn't tell anybody, then they promptly reported. There's a problem with a contradiction, I think, maybe, or an apparent contradiction. They promptly reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions, and after that, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation.
What version, what book is
New
it?
American Standard.
Some
Also,
of these have it at
other
the end of
Bibles.
verse 20, and some have it at the end of verse 8.
Yes, some have it at the end of 20, some have it at the end of verse 8. So that would be one idea of, okay, we've got to wrap this up a little bit better. Maybe that's what Mark wrote. Others say, no, we've got to go and add 9 through 20, which is a fairly long deal, telling about Mary Magdalene, the one who had 7 demons cast out of her. Now see, that sounds a little bit more like Mark, doesn't it? She went and reported to those who had been with them while they were mourning and weeping. They heard but they didn't believe her. And then the next group, as they were told, that they didn't believe them either. And then the disciples are commissioned in 14 on down. And there's this version of the Great Commission. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. Baptize, be saved, disbelieved, condemned. These signs will accompany those who have believed.
In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will pick up serpents, and if they drink any deadly poison, is italics, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. Why do we not like this ending?
My Bible says it wasn't in too reliable manuscript.
Two of the oldest manuscripts they have, it's not there. One writer, and I don't have a way to check it, he said it's in all the families. All the families of manuscripts have this ending. It's just not in most of the older ones. The oldest ones, they aren't there. The two oldest ones, they aren't there.
In the Alexandrian and the,
Vaticanus and Sinai.
No, I think it's
Sinai. Well, there's Sinai and Vaticanus is mentioned. Why don't we like that? What's our hesitancy to accept that as valid?
Because if we get bit by serpents, we'll die. If we drink poison, we're not gonna, not always do we lay hands on
Yeah, we're going to see this as a, there are those who will take this as, well, then we should go pick up serpents to prove that we're disciples.
Yeah.
We should drink something poisonous because we'll prove that we're really disciples. If we speak in tongues, then we will prove that we are disciples. If we lay hands on the sick, then they will recover if we're his disciples.
It's real different than what we've been listening to.
It does sound different.
Sounds
But look at that list and tell me, do you see those things happening anywhere in the book of Acts?
yes.
Yeah. Pretty much everything except drinking poison. You see Paul pick up some sticks and get bit by a serpent, and everybody figured he was going to die, and he didn't. You see them laying their hands on people, people are healed. You see the apostles especially speaking in tongues, proclaiming the truth of God. So we see those things there. So it's not far-fetched to think that it was listed there, but it seems a little bit after the fact in the way that it kind of gets laid out there. And I think we tend to overreact because of the overreaction. The people who want to have a service and let's get a bunch of snakes together and show our great faith. And then we say, oh, that's just crazy talk. And so we kind of sweep that over there instead of saying, okay, it's a possibility. It very well could be. This is not an issue of inspiration. This is an issue of textual, of the text, and whether it belongs to the text or not. So when I preached through Mark twice, I preached as if this was part of it, because these things did follow those who believe. Not every believer could go around picking up snakes. Why do you think Paul was able to pick up a snake, not on purpose, and get bit and not die?
It depends on the snake, but
No, it depends, his job wasn't done yet.
His job wasn't done yet.
Yeah, and I think that's that faith component of, yes, all those things can happen to us if our job isn't done yet as followers. That's not up to us. It's not a test. You don't test God by grabbing a bunch of rattlesnakes. But can you be bit and survive? Sure. I've also driven down the street times I've probably should have been in an accident and wasn't. You know, there's those components of you have a job to do, and God is in control of that, not us. So sure. You know.
And what was Paul doing at the time that he got bit by a snake? Well, he's collecting firewood, but in the bigger picture of things, he was on his way to Rome, and he was making disciples. He was involved in ministry, even as a prisoner. And I think one of the reasons we often don't see some of the things that we wonder about is because we're not doing anything. Or we're in a culture that is, you know, it's not, doesn't make any difference. Why don't we see demonic activity? Are there demons? Are there demons in North America? Yeah, there are. We classify it often as mental illness. Not that all mental illness is that. We had classified it as addiction. Not that all addiction is that. Is there? When is it physical, and when is it emotional, and when is it spiritual? Always. There's always those components. Now, do we need to go running around the grocery store looking for demonized people and casting out demons?
Probably not.
Probably not. But if in the course of taking care of business and doing the thing that God asks us to do, if we encounter a deadly snake, if we encounter a poisonous situation, a demonic thing, somebody who is sick and we pray for them and they very well may be healed. It has nothing to do with how much faith you have or how much faith they have. It has to do with what God wants to accomplish in the midst of it. So from the standpoint that we get a little uncomfortable with this because the way it's worded, and the subjects that it brings up, all of these things pretty much were in the book of Acts. And all of these things historically have shown up at various times in church history. So I don't think we have to be too squeamish. It does sound very different. And it might be kind of, Mark got some help from somebody else in helping wrap this up. There is an argument made that there are 9, and I don't know which ones they are, there are 9 unique words in this section that only Mark uses. Mark uses them earlier in the book, and he uses those same words here in this section, which would tend to lend credibility to the fact that, well, maybe it was Mark. There's nothing here that if we do all the due diligence that Pastor Rob taught us in the first class, if we do the due diligence in studying and following the rules of hermeneutics, that we would come up with some bizarro idea that we gather a bunch of rattlesnakes and put them in a basket and then dance around and speak in tongues and see if they'll bite us and we can prove that we're really filled with the Spirit and belong to God. That's not there. This, as you look at the book of Acts, you see it there. So, does that answer the question?
No.
The answer is, you don't know. There's some of that information. Nothing in 9 through 20 that we don't already have in the New Testament. I want to make sure we spend some time here in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 to 45. This is really the theme of the Gospel of Mark. If you were going to memorize something from Mark, I would suggest that this would be the few verses that you might want to take on. What better way to learn how to be a servant than to be taught by the servant, the ultimate servant, the servant of God, not a servant, the servant of God. And listen to what he says to his disciples. In the midst of a culture that was not just in Jerusalem like this, but in spades as you go to Rome, as you go outside of Israel, it's even more so. He said, calling them to himself, calling his disciples to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know, those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them." Did they understand that? They lived in a place to where if a soldier walked up to you and said, "Here's my pack, I'm going this way," you had to carry it a mile. And if you didn't, you could be killed. They had the authority. They would come in, they would take money from you because it was tax time. And when was it tax time?
All the time.
All the time was tax time, not just April 15th, whenever they wanted it to be tax time. And Pilate and whoever else was in charge of the area, they were under increasing pressure from Rome. More money, more money, more money. And it got worse and worse. So the idea of lording it over isn't the idea of leading or taking care of. That's not what it means. A lot of times we'll react to somebody who's trying to lead, even in a good and godly way, and we'll say, "Well, you're lording it over us. Who made you boss?" Are there bosses? Yes, there are bosses. God has designed it that there is a structure of authority. And so just because somebody who is in a position of authority is exercising authority and doing it in a proper way, doesn't mean they're lording it over you. Lording it over has that idea of intimidation and pressure and
Exploitation.
exploitation. Thank you, that's a great word. So, you know that that's the way it is with them. Verse 43, but it is not this way among you. In my kingdom, it's not this way. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be last, slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served. The Son of Man, capital letters in my Bible. Title of the Messiah. The one who should be served, the one who deserves to be served. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. If we are followers of Jesus Christ, the servant of God, the Son who came to be the servant, and we're going to walk in his steps, the path that he's going to lead us down is a path of service. We chose the name of this school for a reason. The original model was called Contenders, and that's a good biblical idea, contending for the faith. But we didn't want to see it as this contentious thing. We wanted to see it as this. This was kind of in our thinking here, this idea. The Son of Man did not come to be served. Though it was his right, he was the person in authority, and we should serve him, and we do, hopefully. But he came to serve. And to give himself up as a ransom. There's a whole theology thing in here of what is being accomplished. And so we're called as servants, as those who follow Christ. 1 John says, if he loved us this way, we ought to love that way. We ought to lay down our lives for the brethren, just as he laid down his life for the brethren. That's the standard of servanthood. The servant, and that's a place, as I mentioned earlier, it showed the dignity of Jesus in the midst of all of that. He wasn't perceived as a low-class, low-level person. And when we think of being a servant as being below us, beneath us, if we adopt the idea that was prominent in Hellenization and the Greek concept, to work with our hands is somehow beneath us, we've got a problem. Jesus worked with his hands, touching and blessing and healing, as well as whatever else of those things that he did. Questions, real quick. Got time for just one or two, maybe. I can't guarantee I got any answers.
This was very much a sign that I noticed that it struck me. Have a map in here, and in the
What
area.
page is it?
This is page 44.
44?
Mean annual rainfalls are the area we're talking about.
Okay, annual rainfall.
It goes all the way from 50 to 60 inches in the top of the mountains, which is the Olympic Peninsula, to something less than 8, which is the Mojave Desert.
Yeah.
And I didn't ever,
No conclusion, just interesting information.
so you can expect any kind of weather.
Yeah.
And when they talk about the wilderness, it's the
It's the desert.
desert on the edge of the Black Sea.
Red Sea, and the Dead Sea.
Of the Dead Sea.
Yeah, Tim?
Mark 13:13 says, and you should be hated among men for my name's sake. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Almost makes salvation conflict with work there.
It does, doesn't it? That's a good question. A lot of times Mark uses the word saved in connection to physical rescue or endurance of something along those lines.
On this same map,
Yes.
I noticed the wilderness where he was tempted, and we're talking less than 20 miles from Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's not,
It's not a big place.
No.
yeah, Jim?
Janet brought this up. At the end of that verse, it says he gave himself as a ransom for many, not all. So
Good
I'm not willing to
question.
use your parents, you can't.
so that's something to think about too.
The idea that the ransom's paid, whether or not all of them take it, is the many, is,
It could
the
be
many
like say-
is the end result.
Or it could be
For
just
all.
a contrast of one life for many.
One for many,
versus
yes.
I just thought that was interesting, you Mark said many and not all.
And that's one of those cases where you take that verse and you make sure that you look at other verses, what's this teach, and how do you reconcile that idea? And then you come up with a way for it to fit. You know, and immediately as soon as you said that, for the sins of the whole world was 1 John 2. And so you got to, okay, how does that fit with 1 John 2? And I got to come to some sort of understanding of what this is saying and what's that saying, and make sure in the context it says what it says. That's a good point. Let's pray. Lord, to think that you, as the Lord of all the earth, would come to this place and humble yourself and take upon yourself the form of a servant, a bondservant, even to the point of death on the cross. And Lord, the call is for us to have that same kind of thinking, that same attitude, that same mindset as we follow after you. And Lord, on our own, that is impossible. We cannot do that. We will not do that. But by the power of your Spirit in us, and by the power of your word transforming our thoughts and our lives, we can be that. We can follow in the steps of the true servant and be servants as well. We can be those same kind of bond servants, serving because we love you, not because we are paying our debt off, because that debt has been paid. So Lord, may we be bondservants of the Lord Jesus Christ, the true and the great servant. For it's in his name we pray. Amen.